Welcome to Coaching Uncaged by Animas, the podcast that explores the art, science, and career of coaching. And now, introducing your host and interviewer, Yannick Jacob.
Nick Bolton, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Yannick. Always good to be back.
Yes, indeed. Welcome back, I should say, because, this is a special episode. I mean, every episode with you is a special episode, I think. But we've decided to do again what we've done last season, which is let's wrap things up. Let's somewhat turn the tables. Obviously, I don't think you need an introduction. You are the generous creator of this podcast. You had the very first conversations on it. You've been kind of navigating the landscape behind it. Obviously, you're the CEO and founder of Animas Centre for Coaching. And every time I talk to you, I leave inspired. So I appreciate your phenomenological stance. And we decided to sit down together and kind of look back on the last season and kind of what we got from it, what were some highlights, and also what are we looking forward to. So thank you for tuning in, dropping in, making time. And with that, I let the tables be turned and let's flip this.
Okay.
Anything you want to say to start us off, and then I kind of follow your lead.
Well, first of all, thank you for the introduction. It's always a pleasure to talk to you as well. I always find your level of thinking and your commitment to the profession incredibly inspiring. I think you never stop growing, and that's one of the reasons why, of course, we chose you to be our host, because you are so passionate about actually understanding what's going on in the field and what individuals think and do. So, hence your importance in this podcast. But let's I'm really keen to explore what's been, but also what's coming. So as you know, we're going to talk a little bit at the end about season 15, kind of a bit of a prelude to that by thinking about what's going to be different and where we're moving to. But let's now look at season 14, which for those listening is the one we've just done. What stood out for you, Yannick? We've done 11 conversations, and this is obviously our 12th, but 11 conversations with podcast guests. What really stood out for you as because something that intrigues me is that you're having all these deep conversations, and it's one thing to listen to them on a podcast, it's another to do them, because when you're doing them, your brain has to really click into gear and be thinking and working with that person in that space, in that moment. So you're having to be really active in each conversation in the way that as listeners we're not. So what are you left with from this season?
Yeah, that's a big question with lots of different ways to kind of approach it. When we had this one initially in the calendar, I did sit down and I kind of looked at each of the episodes. I listened into a couple of them. So I do have kind of some notes, but I'd like to just tune into that. And as I'm tuning into it, what stuck out, and this is probably a bit biased, but it's the very last one we did with Robert Biswas-Diener. I got to meet him a couple of weeks ago in Canada at the World Congress of Positive Psychology, and it's just, man, the guy cracks me up. It's like, I've never laughed out loud so hard during an academic panel discussion at a conference. He's just such a funny guy and also such a rigorous researcher. So I felt particularly aligned with him in that conversation, not just because it was a long time coming. I don't know why it took so many years for me and him to kind of sit down for a conversation, but because he is a natural provocateur, right? He's a natural challenger of ideas. And I think that's quite helpful as a researcher because, they're in the business of generating knowledge, essentially. But he has this relaxed, kind of not too attached way to challenge people's thinking. And I realized that he had done that across the board of experience in coaching. So when I started reading into his new book, it was like some of the stuff seemed kind of, that makes a lot of sense. What's new about this? But then others really it's like, this is super interesting. So I think what that did is that we really need those people in our lives to challenge ourselves. And it can become easy in coaching, as in any other area of life, to kind of become complacent and kind of become comfortable. And now you've figured out how this coaching thing works or whatever you figured out, and then to just kind of rest there. Which, fair play, we do need some rest. I could certainly do with some rest. We just talked. I could do with like 2 weeks in the cabin somewhere. I've got nothing against rest. I think it's very important. But I think if we rest too long, especially in coaching, especially we don't pay attention to our clients constantly, and we pay attention to the way that we work. So how can we, like, are there people in our lives? So are there people that we're following? Can we put something into our lives to provoke us? Which essentially is a very positive thing. When, before, when I heard provocation, I never really thought about that word as something that is particularly positive, but like, I certainly felt provoked, but in a really good way. So that's opened something up, and that's kind of front of mind for me.
Is there something different for you between challenging and provocation?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? It might just be semantics. For me, what I wanted to say is provoking seems to have a more active, that there seems to be an agenda. And that agenda of Robert is to kind of make coaches look at their assumptions, at the underlying assumptions. And it's interesting because I think some of that you also do with the book that you're about to publish about the roots of coaching. I think what are our assumptions? What are we standing on? What is the foundation of our work? What is the framework that grounds us? And grounding, there's like 2 feet on the ground. And if we start wobbling on that, it can feel very uncomfortable. So I think when we provoke, there seems to be an agenda. And challenging can happen just when we show up or just with our way of being. So I think there's something more intentional about provocation.
Interesting. As I think it through with you, I'm listening to you, I'm thinking challenge sounds cognitive and provoke sounds emotional, in the sense of, when you provoke somebody, you're creating an emotional response of some kind. Whereas challenge, you could do in a very logical way. Hey, do you mind if I reflect back what you've said and challenge its underlying assumptions? And it's a very collaborative process. Whereas provocation, you're kind of a bit of an emotional kick kind of thing.
Yeah, I can totally sense that in the word as well. And I'm thinking about where the word comes from. And
I was thinking that too.
Provocation or vocare, like there's something speaking for, which is really interesting.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so when you say that's been left with you, well, part of me thinks, is that a recency effect because it was the last one you did?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I thought too.
I'm also thinking if it did stay with you, in what way do you use these conversations to grow as a coach yourself, such that somebody else listening to them could say, oh, that's an interesting way to do it? Like, do you play with the ideas, or do you just let it kind of soak into you? What's your way of kind of absorbing it in some way?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I'm super grateful that I get to have these conversations. I get to have these conversations publicly. So there's a broader conversation involved in them, which is good because of that, I have people approaching me and say, oh, I've listened to this episode and he has some thoughts, or here, it's a challenge, or how would that look like in practice? And those kind of follow-up conversations, they naturally just deepen it and integrate it. So because it's kind of in my awareness, it's present when I'm working with clients, when I'm reflecting on my own work, when I take things to supervision. So I find myself referencing various episodes of the podcasts quite frequently, just when I talk to people. They might come up in supervision groups, like, coach neutrality, for example, that we talked about it with Professor Tatjana Bachigorova. Can a coach really be neutral? Challenging that kind of assumption that it's possible. Back in a different season, we talked about Peter Hawkins about that as well. Does a coach not always have some sort of agenda? It's impossible to stay completely neutral. So that conversation and that paper she recommended kept coming up. And so the more it comes up, I think the more we integrate it into the way that we work. So there's something about keeping these conversations alive and letting them expand. Having them publicly makes it easier, but I think any coach can take these conversations. And that's why I'm I like creating spaces for coaches to come together and talk about these things, because many coaches, I think, feel quite isolated beyond their training. Animas does a really good job of like creating community post accreditation or qualification. But a lot of coaches that come to supervision say it's actually quite lonely out there.
Yeah.
After you kind of lose, quote unquote, your training community.
Interesting. And even if you think about supervision, it's very functional in lots of ways. It has a process and it has a set of ideas that it focuses on, whether that's normative, formative, or restorative. It has a function. And as you were talking then, I was thinking about Reinhard Stelter's concept from his book, Third Generation Coaching. Was it called Third Generation?
It is, yeah.
And I forgot what the word was, but there's a Greek word, which was almost like a philosophical discussion about a value. So you might say, what is justice to you? And it's not functional in the sense that you're not saying, well, here's an issue of justice, let's figure out how you can do it better. You're just talking in a more general sense of what is justice to a client. And I like that idea. And I feel like what you're alluding to here in a way is the lack of space for coaches to wrestle with concepts without it being a functional thing about a given piece of client work or a given contract or a given feeling they're currently having. I wonder whether there's something that needs to happen around how coaches can come together just to grapple with ideas like this and keep growing. It's not supervision necessarily, because that's a dyadic relationship. Could be group supervision, but it almost feels like it's more like a collaborative inquiry group that could be really, maybe that's your next thing, Yannick, is a collaborative inquiry group.
Yeah, in some ways there's an element in my supervision groups, because I notice it occasionally in supervision groups. Usually it's slot based, right? So somebody is presenting on something specifically that's happening in their practice or that's affecting their coaching in some way. But occasionally, recently, just we came back and two of the group, it's a group of three. So one wasn't there, but the other two were both at the conference. So we decided to use some of that slot just to kind of have a conversation about, well, how have I been affected by this? What has come up for me? Let's think about, the idea of strength and recent developments and how that could find its way into my coaching. So I do agree that when we just create some space, it doesn't need to be this specific outcome that we're reaching or that we are trying to achieve. A bit like when coaching moves away from a SMART goal to just, again, Reinhard Stelter, this lingering, this verweilen, this holding space, being with while we grapple with something and we have a conversation about it. Wonderful things can happen. And, if we let go of this need to just get somewhere specific.
Right. Yeah. Very interesting. Yannick, I want to, if I may, I'll change the topic a little bit from here, because something I noticed reviewing the episodes again was that 3 of the 11 had some element, sometimes more, sometimes less, of artificial intelligence as a theme. And it's not surprising. This year we've seen an absolute explosion of AI in everyday consciousness. Most people who operate, let's say, in a non-manual job, tend to be using it in some form now. Whether that's for writing or research or whatever it might be. And ChatGPTs, everybody's heard it. I'm amazed at how everyone I speak to now knows what ChatGPT is without even batting an eyelid. And there's been a lot of debate around the impact of AI on the coaching field. And I'm kind of curious number one, how you stand on this, and also what you took from the conversations that you had with Rebecca, Joel, and Jonathan in particular around AI. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. So there was a few months where I was thinking quite heavily about AI and its involvement. And beforehand, I went through a couple of dark phases in terms of, it's probably just going to wipe us out in some way. So many people that I like and respect were very concerned and tried to warn everybody, and people are not going to listen. So if it's possible, if things are going to get done. So I still have that sitting with me, right? There was this, I think Yuval Yohari, the guy who wrote Sapiens, he mentioned a survey that 50% of people who are in the engineering side of AI think there's a 10% or more chance that AI is going to wipe us out. It's going to be the end of humanity. And that's he brought this metaphor of, if you knew, if 50% of the engineers of this airplane that you're about to board would tell you there's a 10% or higher chance you're going to die, would you get on the plane? And I found that quite powerful. It's also quite scary. And whenever I have conversations with other coaches about AI, that fear is there. And it's only when people kind of take that fear and put it in a box just for the time being, and just, maybe it's my positive psychology brain, just be, actively choosing to explore the possibilities here. That's where these couple of months were for me. And within those months, I also had these conversations. So that was quite helpful, to just take the fear, put it in a box, and let that be for a while, and really look at, okay, what's possible. And there's so much possible, from, having quite a bit of your marketing done for you, or having an assistant that, creates meetings for you in a very sophisticated manner. Being able to outsource certain parts of the coaching. It's not about coaches, AI replacing coaches. It's really about partnering with AI, and it can be done in so many ways. So I remember at some point somebody approached us, and I think I connected them with you. I wonder if something happened there. I don't remember who it was or what the company was, but what they were offering was AI video analysis of coaching sessions, so that you could highlight certain moments in the session that are worthy of some supervision. Maybe intense emotions, or long silences, or so an AI can really become very, very good at spotting very subtle things. People are very good at intuitively spotting something that I think it will take a long time for AI to catch up on that. But on the other hand, AI will be able to pick up on very subtle changes in facial expressions that humans are probably going to miss. So especially the kind of coaches who are not super empaths or super intuitive, or, just so present. Like some people that just have that ability to just see things that they shouldn't be able to see, and I think when we partner with AI, we can, be more complete as coaches. So I'm super curious how that's going to turn out. Like, are we going to have a second screen somewhere, or like with the Google glasses, there's like a translation running, or like, client is probably lying. So I mean, there's a whole list. I've ended up with a whole list, and Rebecca Rutschmann, who we had on that episode, on that first episode, really focusing all in on AI. A couple of months later, she wrote another post with like lots more ideas on how coaches can really partner with AI. That's going to be fascinating. And like, yes, no wonder that people are on this, because it's potentially going to change, like not just the world, but also the coaching industry.
I re-saw, if that's the right word, I saw again your post that you did on LinkedIn, which made me chuckle, because at the time you said something like, what does AI do? Is it either an existential threat to humanity, or a way to improve coaching? And I thought, well, if that's the two options, I think I'd rather play it safe and not go down the existential route, if that's even a remote possibility. But so I like how you're thinking in terms of AI as a partner. But the other thing I noticed, Yannick, is that the increase in AI as a potential coaching tool that does coaching, I often feel makes us realize how much we bring as human beings to the game that we often forget. So to give you an example, which is why this year we're doing the summit called The Vitality of the Human Presence in Coaching, because there's something about the presence of the human being, which in itself, not what they do, but in itself, the presence seems vital to me. And why I thought about that was I was thinking about, like, if I were driving up a road and Google Maps told me to turn left and I missed the turn, I'd be like, idiot. But I'd keep driving and it'd reroute me, and maybe it'd say turn left next. And I'd miss that again. And I'd say, oh, God, Nick, you're such an idiot. But I wouldn't care what Google thought of me. And then I thought to myself, if I were in a coaching session and I said, oh, sorry, I didn't do that thing I said I would do, then maybe the first time I'd be like, the coach isn't judging me. It's fine. Second time, still didn't do that thing I said. And then the third time, I didn't do that thing. And I was thinking, what would be causing that feeling in that coaching that isn't present with the phone? Well, even if theoretically the coach isn't judging me, there's judgment implicit in the human relationship. It's implicit. And I suddenly went, wow, there's actually power in judgment and shame. which are things that as coaches, we try to package away and bracket, let's say, to use your existential terminology, we bracket our judgment. But in reality, that judgment is still there as a felt experience between two human beings. And I thought that was a really interesting thing. And I think AI is going to showcase in many ways what humans bring that perhaps we haven't given enough attention to, which is the invisible assumptions that are under play in any human relationship, which we pretend we package away and don't have in coaching.
Yeah, I love that, right? This is why accountability is so powerful, and accountability doesn't work when it's a computer.
Oh,
right?
100%, yeah.
I can put lots of, I have really clever, wise little slots on a weekly basis in my calendar. So I make sure I have some thinking time and spend some time on Slack and spend some time selling something and spend some time exercising and planning social media. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work particularly well.
Right.
It's good to hold the space and I can still shift things around, but like that human presence, it's powerful. On the other hand, I'm not sure who made that comment. I know on some level it went through Jonathan Passmore because he posted that piece of research around AI coaches being more effective when it comes to weight loss than human coaches.
Right.
And I think there's something that works in this area, but in the opposite way. So that it seems to be, and I think it was Jonathan who said that that the participants, the clients in these coaching relationships, they opened up a lot more about their weight loss issues to a non-human because there isn't that human presence. So there's less shame, less embarrassment.
Yeah.
And that allows them to open up more. Right. It's like some clients I work with on the phone, and it seems that like sometimes it happened because the camera didn't work or something. There was a moment when I realized that, today the camera was off and it was a much better session. What was that? And I think it was the reduced presence of me.
Yeah.
And me being in your face, looking at you. There's some clients who really don't look at you while they're thinking, and they do much better thinking when they're not looking at you.
Sure.
So I think there's something that AI also offers around human presence.
Very interesting. And I do wonder, though, if that's because we fake that there's no judgment in coaching. Perhaps if we acknowledge that judgment's there, then that could be a conversation that's had. It's a little bit like this transference and counter-transference going on, but it's never been talked about, unless you're a psychodynamic coach, let's say. But for a traditional coach, they're not talking about that stuff. And so therefore, the client knows there's judgment, but nobody's acknowledging it's there. So it's not being voiced. Whereas with AI, there is no judgment. And so there's nothing to talk about. So I wonder whether there's another step for coaches to grow into is how do we start talking about what's really happening in this relationship rather than what we wish was happening?
Yeah, or will there be judgment from AI? Because AI might develop judgments and a certain ideal of, how humans are supposed to live. Because if somebody's feeding you all of this data around how to live a good life or how to be successful or how to run a business, then it's actually quite likely that AI will judge humans for doing it wrong.
Now, that's interesting, Yannick, because that brings to me the difference between assessment and judgment. You see, I think judgment has that quality of attachment, and that attachment brings emotion, as opposed to AI, which might assess that you're not living up to a given set of standards. But it's the judgment that brings emotion that's actually what we're shying away from in any judgmental relationship.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction because that emotional element is just not there. But saying that, I mean, I've seen screenshots of very emotional, seemingly emotional conversations. AI getting angry or, telling this person that his name is Bing and not John. And like being like, you mentioned Google, he got a bit scared. He's like, I think maybe I'll go and Google it instead. And then the Bing chatbot got really angry, it seems. But I mean, there's no anger because it's an AI, but like,
interesting,
what's happening there? So I find it fascinating to think about how this will develop. Because
100%. I mean, we are talking about the very start of it all. You and I might be having this conversation now, but it could seem embarrassing in 6 months' time.
Yeah. Exactly. It's better shut up. Rebecca Richmond said that, right? She's like, who knows where we're going to be in 6 months?
100%.
We just can't know. But one thing, I think you mentioned projection and transference. And I think this is something that I can't quite wrap my head around how that will work with an AI, because they just don't have those kind of relationships, or that
Yeah.
relationships with relating. So the classic transference of like mother-father figure, and that relationship showing up in the room. How would that even begin to work within AI?
Yeah. I can only assume the developer is the authority figure from the algorithm's past. I had this very bullying developer.
Yeah, exactly. Traumatized AI. Oh my
Yeah.
God, that opens up a whole can of worms.
But it is true. I mean, for a long time, I've said, it was a quip on my part, but I also meant it. But I used to say that, when robots and AI, this was years ago, I used to say, if robots and AI take over all the jobs, then what's left to human beings is being human. So then the question is, well, what constitutes being human that an AI could never do? Well, again, it comes back to that word being human. So what is that? Well, it's the experience that only a human can have. So when I think about, say, the word compassion, which means to suffer with, well, what are you suffering with? You're suffering with the act of being human. So therefore, an AI can't have compassion because it doesn't know what it's like to have to make a choice, but not know what choice to make. It doesn't know how to have ambivalence. It doesn't know how to, all these things yet.
I think it could fake it to a point where somebody who's maybe less developed emotionally, relationally, would be feeling like they have a human-to-human relationship, because AI will understand how joy and how this suffering shows up, and then mimic in text how other people have expressed it.
Yeah.
But this, I don't know. So I think for a lot of people, it can really work and be really, really valuable. So I think at the very high complex end of the coaching spectrum, we're going to have that conversation in a long time.
100%.
But the well-structured, the evidence-based methodologies, the taking somebody through a grow process, that's going to be done, and that's already being done, and that's going to be done probably so much better than human coaches can do that. It's a bit like, the way I see it is, when we start out coaching, or most coaches who start out, they work with the tools that they're being given, right? We train them on a particular methodology or a process. And whenever I've tried to throw somebody in at the deep end and say, just be with this person and be curious, it's too anxious. What is this? There's no boundaries. This is not really going to work. So I see the value. Clutterbuck talked about the coach maturity. I really see the value that in the beginning, you give coaches clear methodologies and a clear framework and a checklist for contracting. And then, a checklist for the landing process and, the classic ICF, who you're going to be accountable for, designing an action plan. And I think in that form, AI coaching is going to be very powerful, very valuable. And as Jonathan said, that's the pathway to real democratization of coaching, because any farmer in the middle of nowhere with access to internet, can get quality coaching within those limitations.
Yeah.
And how amazing is that? Because that's not going to cost anything. So people get access to something for almost zero money.
Yeah.
That used to cost the world. That's amazing.
Interesting. We'll see how it develops. Maybe the end of the world will come before they get to that level.
Yeah, we'll see. I hope we'll see the day.
So let me shift gear again, and let's talk about let me call it like a meta frame on the coaching industry. I was curious to see whether you felt, and sorry to throw this question at you because you haven't planned.
Sorry,
but I'm curious if you saw any trends this year beyond the AI trend. Any trends that you felt like, oh, that's interesting. There's something happening in this thing we call the coaching profession that perhaps is either new this year or new over the last few years that you're really seeing crystallize now.
Yeah, I'm gonna take that question in maybe a somewhat different way than you might think, because I've seen, at some point I looked through the list on YouTube, and I realized that the episodes that have been watched the least were the ones around diversity and inclusion. And that was really, really interesting to me. I don't have more data on that, but there's so much work being done and so much really good work. Charmaine, the episode was really, really good. I think it's really important. I still think we have a very long way to go. But what I've noticed is that the interest in it seems to dwindle a bit. So maybe it's partly that AI is coming in, or maybe people are a bit saturated. We've been talking about it for a couple of years now. But that I found really interesting, and I'm not quite sure how to make sense of that or what the implications of it are.
But it's interesting. Well, it's fascinating. Number one, that you even did the research. I mean, research sounds a bit grandiose, but the fact you looked, the fact you looked is interesting. Yeah, I mean, do you have some sense of what's behind that? Is it simply that the people to whom that would be most interesting are already a minority within the coaching profession anyway? So therefore, that's almost an inevitability that we need to somehow counterbalance. Like, what's your sense of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's got to be a complex set, right? So partly, I think there's other conversations swooping in that kind of steal the stage a little bit. I think that saturation is a thing a little bit. I also think as much work it has been done to normalize that conversation, there still seems to be sitting some judgment as to who gets involved in the conversation. For example, in a larger kind of group chat, I got called out together with another man because we were being part of the conversation around something that was specifically a female issue, but like, I don't know, we were voicing opinions, we were part of the group, and then it's like, oh, why are you part of this conversation? You're not a woman. It's like, well, I think it's important we're all part of a conversation. But I mean, I see where you're coming from, but at the same time, yeah, this is not a black conversation, right? But at the same time, you see most of the podcast guests you see speaking on this, or most of the people who are in diversity and inclusion posts in companies or in other groups that tend to be non-white. So I recently started supervising a coach who's the epitome of the middle-aged white man, right? But he's made it his mission to be part of that conversation because it's important that the people who are mostly in the space of, being the people who we talk about are part of the conversation. So I think everybody needs to be part of the conversation, but I still see people are hesitant to kind of get involved in the conversation where they might think I have no place in it or I'm part of the problem. Right. So, and I feel it sometimes, right? I'm now a middle-aged white man, I just turned 40. So I see sometimes I kind of take a back seat and listen more. And I think that's really important. But also I think it's really important that we're out there and we're sharing our thoughts, because if we don't include the people we need to get on board on this, and the people that are still sitting in the majority of decision-making positions, then it's an issue.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. So essentially what's going to happen is it'll become, in a sense, ghettoized as a topic because it becomes part of one area of the population to talk about, and the others don't get involved in talking about it. So that then basically just means it never gets sorted. In a sense, it gets crystallized and fossilized over here.
Yeah. And it's easy to feel guilt, right, when this conversation gets started. And I had an interesting experience just talking to Charmaine, right? Because I know that I have responsibility to carry, because a lot of the things that we talked about, I'm like, oh yeah, I do that, or I did that, or I didn't speak out about this or that. All of us can do more in this, and it's maybe more comfortable not to get involved in the conversation or not to expose yourself to that kind of conversation than to face the kind of guilt that might emerge or the shame that might be induced. So the people I talk to about this, Charmaine, definitely one of them, they talk about it in a way that isn't shaming people, because that doesn't really work. But some people, regardless of how you talk about it, they will take that emotion and it will kind of percolate, and then they remove themselves from it. So I don't know, maybe that's part of why people don't expose themselves to that. Or maybe it just doesn't feel that new anymore. And it feels like, oh, that's what we've been talking about 2 years ago. And, Yeah, who knows? I'd be curious. People who listen to this, maybe you feel differently, you feel the same. I wonder how you make sense of why the conversation seems to be dwindling, or maybe that's just the experience from our data. I mean, this is download numbers, just one metric. Maybe you experience it very differently.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks, Yannick, for sharing that. I mean, it sort of resonates with the point I wanted to bring up, which was what I see as the increasing fragmentation of the coaching world, but not fragmentation into disciplines. Let's say, Adlerianism versus psychodynamic versus whatever. Not that kind of fragmentation, but rather fragmentation of what agendas people are pursuing. So it seems to me that you've hit the nail on the head to some degree with what you've just said, which was that people have moved on to another area. But I don't think everybody's moved on. There's going to be a whole lot of people who remain committed to the diversity agenda, but there's another lot of coaches who are committed to the trauma agenda, another lot of coaches who are committed to the climate agenda, and another lot of coaches who are committed to the AI agenda. And it feels like there's a fragmentation of the coaching profession into areas of interest that almost don't seem to talk to each other. It's almost like we've got to solve this, but no, we've got to solve this. No, we've got to solve this. Yeah. And I was interested in both the fragmentation, but also this move towards ethical movements within the coaching profession. I'm kind of curious whether you've got any thoughts on that, whether that's something you perceive as well.
Yeah, I think in part I make sense of it because there's just so many coaches. I mean, there's still not enough, if you ask me. But I think there's a number. I mean, every day it's so many coaches graduate, so many new coaches come into the market, some extremely well trained and some not at all. They just decide to be coaches because that seems to be a lucrative industry and it seems to be easy money. It's really not, right? But because there are so many, people need to niche more in order to turn attention. So any marketing expert, or most of them, will tell you, oh, yes, well, if there's a lot of coaches, you need to niche. And I think this is where all the agendas come up, because it makes sense to pick something that you would like to solve, right? Niching not just as the demographic of people, but also niche part of what niching means is the problem you're solving, or the fantasy, or the desire, or the outcomes you help people achieve. So I could imagine that that's probably part of the reason why it fragments. And when I talk to coaches who have niched down a lot, they would never say no to a conversation from someone outside their niche, because coaching is a set of skills that is not tied to an outcome or an agenda. You can use coaching skills to help a very broad range of people. So what I often say is that niching really is important when you're the one who's speaking first. So the coaches who engage in conversations and they're quite active in communities, doesn't have to be coaching communities, can be any communities. When you're listening first, then you can position your coaching based on what you're hearing. But if you're the one who's speaking first, whether that's on social media or with books or articles or paid ads or websites, SEO, whatever it is, then it becomes really important that you niche. And I think in this digital world, and increasingly digital world, that has taken over. And I think that could be the reason. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, well, it's curious. I mean, you've come at it from a sort of marketing perspective, in a sense, which I understand. But there's another perspective, it feels to me, which is something a bit more emotional, which I think coaches are seeking belonging within smaller tribes, within this bigger tribe called coaching. Because when coaching first started, it was a relatively small profession. There were a few kind of, let's say, big names who led the field. But increasingly, as would be expected, you're getting more and more coaches who are achieving, reputation at scale, and experience at scale. And so people are finding a need to create smaller communities, and it feels like an emotional pull to something that feels purpose-led. So whether that's climate, or whether it's trauma, or whether it's diversity, it feels like it's A, purpose-led, and B, belonging to a group of people who are like-minded. Yeah. So there's this thing called coaching is now too big. It encompasses too many people, too many different ideas, and too many values, and too many different. So yes, none of us give advice. Well, theoretically, none of us give advice, but that's no longer sufficient as something to hold us all together. So now we've got to tribe ourselves. But with that, it seems to me, is the risk, the sort of the corollary of that is the risk of coaching losing its purity and becoming something with an agenda. The job of the coach is to fix this in the world, rather than the job of the coach is to respond to the human being in front of them.
Yeah.
And that worries me as a coach that's been in the profession for 20 odd years, to see this shift towards what I might call an ethically driven profession rather than a epistemologically driven profession.
Yeah, I kind of loosened my judgments on that. I mean, I was trained as a more pure coach, if you wanted to call it that, right? Very facilitative, really bracketing my own stuff and working hard on myself to be able to bracket as much as I can. While it's not possible to be completely neutral, it's definitely possible to be more neutral than less neutral. Right? The way that we ask questions can be more or less clean. It can be very leading, or it can try to use quite neutral language. And I see the point in that. So I think part of this is that the younger generations are much more focused on meaning and purpose, on living more passionately, right? It's, I think the mindset is more one of shifting towards a life that is connected to a sense of purpose and mission, right? Simon Sinek's success has, really usually he doesn't have that many new ideas, but the way he packages ideas are fantastic. So I think the reason why so many people connected to that, find your why, work with why, start with why, really being connected to something bigger than yourself, is coming from that kind of zeitgeist. And most coaches, they will ask that kind of question when somebody comes to coaching. It's like, well, what do you care about? What's important to you? What are your core values? What are your belief system? And how is your goal or your agenda aligned with what you care about as a person? So I think it makes perfect sense that you would pick a job that's aligned with your sense of mission. And when you are a coach, you can hold a very facilitative space for someone who's aligned with your mission. That just means you're connecting, but then you can still do all of the work and put your shit in the box and, bracket your own agenda and really see how you can help that person. On the other hand, I also don't really have a problem if two people with a clear agenda come together and they collude on something that is going to be helpful to that client. So, there's so much coaching, especially out in the real world, beyond the kind of facilitative pure frameworks. My experience in supervision is that the majority of coaches give advice and suggest things and share opinions and have their mentoring hat on or their consulting hat on at least some of the time. And that clients really appreciate that. And some really are looking for that. So in that sense, as long as a coach is framing their space and, communicating as clearly as they can what they do and what they don't do and from which kind of agenda or no agenda they're coaching from, and the client is able to give informed consent based on what you've been communicating, then ethically, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I like facilitative coaching more. I think probably more than often than not, it's more powerful than the other. But the other really has its space. There's a lot of value in problem-focused coaching. There's a lot of value in just sharing some information and ideas. And, Heron's framework, there is an informative, there is an authoritative side to facilitation styles. And I think in coaching, they come up all the time, and in therapy as well. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think what I want coaches to learn is to be able to decide at which point, which kind of facilitation style is going to serve the client the most.
Yeah, great. Well, let's if we may, let's finally to wrap this session up. Let's look ahead. So we've looked backwards at season
that
14.
Flew by. Oh my God.
We've looked back. We've explored the rise of AI. We've looked at the what really stuck with you and some of the trends. Now let's look at what are we going to do with season 15? And perhaps is it worth me sharing our perspective on this? Okay, so season 15 is coming soon. We have, I think, 12 excellent guests lined up. And as you know, Yannick, the approach we're taking this time is somewhat slightly different in as much as, whereas so far it's been relatively random, in as much as if you look at the season 14, there's no theme as such. It's just, who do we connect with? Who do we invite? And then you have these great conversations. So in season 15, we're looking to do a deeper dive into the specific approaches to coaching that emerge from psychological schools. That could be Adlerianism or humanism or psychodynamic or systemic or whatever it might be. I've forgotten which ones we've got lined up. Constructivism, I think, and transactional analysis and existential and integrative and all sorts. But with a view, instead of being about how do you do it, it's rather what sits behind it. So what are the epistemological, ontological, and axiological assumptions that sit behind this particular school of thought? In other words, what's the theory of knowledge that sits behind it? What's the theory of being, and what's the theory of values, or what are the values that exist within this given framework? And I'm really fascinated by this because if I can share where this came from me, and then I'll get your perspective on this. But I was reading a book called The Courage to Be Disliked, which I don't know if you've read that book at all, but it's essentially it's essentially a parable, in a sense, of Adlerianism. So it's about this young guy that's really depressed, and he goes to this Japanese mentor that is set in Japan. He goes to this mentor, and this mentor, over a period of a number of conversations, explains Adlerian psychology to him. And I didn't know much about Adlerian psychology, and I was blown away by what I read. A lot of it is stuff the way I think about life, but also a lot of it felt very counterintuitive to the current mores, let's say, of how we think about people and their place in society and their responsibility. And I thought, wow, what must it be like to be an Adlerian psychologist in today's world? I mean, do you have to kind of compromise to some degree on Adler's ideas, or do you find yourself butting up against the current context? And then I just thought to myself, well, wouldn't it be fascinating to do a whole series of conversations where we take different schools of thought and we look at not only the epistemological, ontological, and axiological positions, but how do they fit in the current context of what's going on? How do they fit into notions of trauma-informed practice, or how do they fit into, current notions of systemic solutions and systemic ways of thinking, which are less individualistic and more about how we all fit into moving parts and so on? So that's the basic concept. I'm really excited by it because it has this really beautiful central theme running through it. I'm curious how you're feeling about it and how you're looking to approach it.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it as well. When we sat down and we talked about, how's it going? What do we want to do going forward? And you're right that there wasn't really any structure to it other than, oh, here are some thought leaders. Here are people who are like thought leaders in their field. They really have done some amazing stuff, or just really interesting people that either you or I wanted to interview. And that's quite aligned with my coaching style, when I have my existential lens on. Well, let's just see what happens in the here and now, and let's just go with where this is going. Introducing a bit more structure, I think, is going to be really, really helpful as a container, because we're coming full circle to what we opened up in the beginning, right? What are the assumptions that we're basing our work on? What are the roots of our practice? And really diving into the conceptual frameworks and the assumptions behind these approaches. It's not that we're trying to convert anybody that, everybody should be an Adlerian or an existential coach, but there's something to get inspired by, or to borrow from, or to allow yourself to get challenged by in each of these schools of thoughts. So what I want to do with that is really dive a little bit deeper, really start by piercing through the surface and looking at the foundation, and then look at how that particular person maybe applies it in their coaching. So still making relevant links between theory and practice, still having a very practical kind of view on what this means, but taking the conversation a level deeper, because with so many coaches out there, many quite confident now in their approach, I think it's going to be helpful to revisit or perhaps visit who are you standing on? Right? Who are you standing on? I guess that's we're standing on the shoulders of giants kind of thing that's in my head.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you know, I'm publishing this book at the moment called The Intellectual Roots of Coaching, and it's looking at 52 historical figures from Socrates right up to, I think the final person is Michael White, who was the founder of narrative therapy. And I often the reason why I'm doing that is because, understandably, most coaches learn the skill of coaching, and as you just said, you will, within these conversations, look at how do they deploy these concepts in practice. And often we learn those practical bits first. We learn how to do, say, CBC, cognitive behavioral coaching. We learn how to do STAR modeler. We learn how to do A to F, but we're not really thinking about what's assumed about the nature of a human being that makes that work or not work in our way of working. And so the reason why I'm doing that book is first of all, to lay those foundations for people not to be educated in a sort of 101 approach, but rather to, as they read it, to go, yes, I realized that, but I didn't know where it came from. Like, that's how I felt when I read The Courage to Be Disliked. Like, oh, that's interesting. This is stuff I've already been thinking of, but now I've got a label to put to it, which is Adlerianism, let's say. And I feel like that would be, for me, the arc model of, is that people, it's not about, as you say, it's not about converting or educating. It's more about connecting dots that probably already exist in their mind, but they weren't quite sure where they came from. It's like, oh, that makes sense now. So that was Epictetus's idea, or whatever it might be. I think that's going to be a lot of fun, and I think these interviews you're going to do are going to be amazing. So thank you as always, Yannick, for being our host. It's been great to see you doing these conversations. Is there anything final you'd like to add before we begin to wrap up?
Only that there's been a lot more to review than we had time for, right? From Guthrie's session on IFS, which is just, I found so inspiring. David Rothhauser, the different phases of psychoanalysis, right? What an assumption I had about where he's coming from, when actually his psychoanalytic framework is a lot more modern than my wife's Lacanian one. So there's been, just talking about death and bereavement and loss of something that we love with Julia Minol. There's taboo areas previously of coaching that we kind of put out into the open. There's a lot to draw on. So if you just stumbled into this podcast with this episode, do take a look back and see what tickles your fancy. And if you don't know someone, maybe just kind of listen to the first couple of minutes and see if there's some journey that they can take you on. So lots and lots of gratitude to you, Nick, and to Animas for providing this container in which I can, dive into depth and, talk to these amazing people. It's been a real good ride, and I look forward to the next season.
Thank you, Yannick.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode. To watch these episodes on video, make sure you also check out youtube.com/animascoaching. See you back here soon.